locking them up today, they're throwing away the key. I wonder who it'll be tomorrow, you or me. They're locking them up today, they're throwing away the key. I wonder who it'll be tomorrow, you or me. We're all normal and we want our freedom. 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 Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. We have a special guest today, Will Tucker, and the title of his presentation is Utopia through Kenosis. How you doing today, Will?
Doing very well, Doug. Nice to see you.
Great, thank you. Okay, nice to have you on here. So this sounds really good. I dropped the word kenosis the other day in a presentation, and I said you're gonna kind of help us through that concept and do a bit of a visual journey. Anything before we get into this, anything going on around the world that you want to mention?
Well, there's almost too much going on to mention, I think, but hopefully some current event issues will pop up in our conversation.
Okay. I got a message last night. I think it was from Substacks. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Thaddeus Kozinski, just making a statement from the Catholic tradition and in good philosophical part of our intellectual tradition that there is no moral equivalency. And I think if we take that part of our tradition and just apply it to what's going on, it's important. To get this straight in our own minds right now, what's going on, in case people grew up in a situation that their mothers told them, hopefully, that genocide's not okay. But apparently, when I see what's going on around the world, most people lost the memo from their mother in that regard. And I truly, okay, by the way, the book should be here within a week. Okay, a huge strain among the many weaving it together is Eric Voegelin or Voegelin. And I truly get what he was talking about when he said modern Christianity is Gnostic Christianity. It's so evident right now, but maybe I'll talk about that at another time. But these things come around, y'all. And I frankly don't know if I can keep talking about this or have the will just to keep going, on all of this. But it's pushing a boulder up a hill and there's just not much, but I'll try. But at any rate, my book's coming out. I get exhausting just going against the flow of everything all the time. But, and my prediction, I don't make many predictions. I just kind of see what's being said out there, but there's going to be a scapegoating situation again, and things are going to go full circle. That's pretty obvious typology. And another one is a typology from World War II. It's like, well, I'm not a crazy one of those people calling for the complete leveling, so I'm just going to look the other way. And you've probably heard it one too many times that this has happened before in the last century. They came for the gypsies and I looked the other way, and they came for the sodomites and I looked the other way. And this is going to come full circle. And I'm going to get into your topic, Lou. I didn't mean to discuss this, but I'm just floored sometimes about just the lack of just some simple, basic empathy on the part of humans, people that claim to represent the faith. It's discouraging to me, but hey, y'all, I'm going to keep going. I'm doing it for you. So the book should be out for a week. And of course, I got to get in promotion mode, so I don't want to be a downer. So I just can't help myself. I'm in shock. I'm in absolute shock by people not just being able just to make a basic statement like, and just side with the major humanitarian creeds of the last 50 years, of even just the basic tenets of the United Nations Pact on Humanitarian Treatment of People. How can people just keep? I know how they can. I know how they can. Okay. Sorry, Will. Sorry. So we're going to talk Utopia through Kenosis today. And I'm going to let you do your thing, Will. I'm going to let you do your thing on the dance floor already.
All right. I like that Vogan quote you mentioned about how modern Christianity is Gnostic Christianity. I think that's going to go very well with what I plan on presenting. And also what you just said about, moral equivalency as being used as a excuse to just turn away and not take a stand as this genocide unfolds in front of us. And it's falling back into accidental history motifs that as though one side here is not working both sides. And that's hopefully what I'm going to talk about, this strategy of working both sides and how that's a part of, killing oneself, attacking oneself, allowing oneself to be attacked as part of this Gnostic world redemption project. And so we're going to critique ourselves here and start off with, talking about the church and this relationship between contemporary and modern art and architecture and the radical changes that took place in the 1960s in the Vatican. So I'm going to start off. Let me share my screen here. Can you see that okay?
It'll probably click in here in just a second.
Yeah, I'm working with a really slow internet connection, so I apologize if it's glitchy.
I got it.
Yeah. All right. So in the 1960s and late 60s and early 70s, at the end of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI, who was the Pope that was the signatory on the Vatican II documents like Nostra Aetate that we talked about in our E. Michael Jones conversation. He's also the Pope who, at the end of Vatican II, handed over the papal tiara that was he was coronated with when he became Pope. This is what Wikipedia says about this. Paul VI did away with much of the regal splendor of the papacy. He was the last pope to date to be crowned on the 30th of June, 1963. His successor, Pope John Paul I, substituted inauguration for the papal coronation. And it goes on and on and on. So he did this as an act of lowering the church and giving up his regal image, its monarchical and militant image as being the preeminent institution on earth with the preeminent supernatural claims. Not only that, he gave away his papal ring, the signet ring here, to the Archbishop of, or I believe it was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So an Anglican. Here's a quote by Pope Paul VI, and it was done, the giving over the papal tiara was done as a gesture for it to be sold off and auctioned to give the money to the poor. So this idea of the church as a suffering church, a servant church, that's lowering itself from its throne to wash the feet of the peasants and to be like the lowest amongst society. So, this very utopian kind of view of the world and the church's relationship in the world rather than, a heavenly view of it. So here's a quote. Mankind today is seeking a new earth, new not because it will be filled with the superfluous luxuries and that technology and industrial progress can provide, but new because the hungry will be fed, the homeless housed, the ill cared for, the illiterate educated, a world where all men can live more humanly. This will be a new earth of justice and love in which those who have been blessed with much will share what they have with those who have less. And for the Christian who has received the gift of eternal life, the chance to help others becomes the occasion to express gratitude for the salvation received from the Lord. So, calling for a new earth, and this sort of millennialist imagery, and that's building off the optimism of the Second Vatican Council and the hope that after World War II and the catastrophes therein, the church reimagining itself would open up this new age of peace and progress. So,
Can I jump in?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm assuming this happened after that infamous Catacombs Pact to create the poor church, which all just seems like window dressing for a big commie agenda, saying that this new heaven and new earth, that's what God brings about at the end of time. It's not for us to bring that about. God said, in fact, or Christ said, the poor will always be with us, reminding us that reality is hierarchical, transcendent, and historical. So this just seems like I'm in a mood today, I guess. It just sounds like a big commie takeover that pretends to be about one thing, but it's really about something else. But I'm gonna let you go on.
I love it, Doug. Bring it on. Let's get nasty. So yeah, also Pope Paul VI is very famous for his quotes that through some crevice, the smoke of Satan has entered the Vatican, alluding to the idea that there's been some sort of infiltration and corruption of the church from its enemies. He's also said, the church finds herself in an hour of anxiety, a disturbed period of self-criticism, or what would even better be called self-demolition, or auto-demolition, or auto-destruction. It is an interior upheaval, acute and complicated, which nobody expected after the council. So it's my contention that this sort of signaling that there's been some sort of catastrophe or corruption within the church, and simultaneous with, okay, that now the church has to reimagine itself and lower itself, is a way of confusing and blurring the who's responsible. So I think if we look at Pope Paul VI, who also proclaimed himself the Pope to the artists and gave many papal speeches about the role of art and this focus on contemporary art. He established a contemporary art exhibit, permanent contemporary art collection at the Vatican, which we're going to look at today, and kind of look at some threads and some trends and patterns to sort of see what's going on beneath the surface and these conflicted mixed messaging that we're getting from Pope Paul VI. So here's an article from 1973 from the New York Times. Pope opens Vatican Gallery of Modern Art holding 600 works. So when Pope Paul VI was Cardinal Montini, he was an avid art collector, and he mostly collected artworks of a movement called social realism, which was very prominent in the United States during the New Deal era and the Works Projects Administration, where the Roosevelt administration funded, through the New Deal, artists to produce artworks for basically propaganda purposes. And a lot of these artists were immigrants from Russia and from Germany, mostly Jewish, who worked in the Bauhaus and the Russian constructivist movement. And so they imported a lot of these socialist ideas, but then now the emphasis sort of fused with the new Soviet realism was to depict scenes of working class exploitation, labor conditions, and to romanticize this coming socialist utopia. So Paul VI, this article talks about the inauguration of this new modern art museum within the Vatican, and this new idea of the sacred and beauty and abstraction, and how modern art is not at odds with, no longer after Vatican II, with the Catholic faith. And then it goes on to list the artists who are exhibited in this first inaugural exhibition. So we have a list here. I'm going to read this. Pope Paul also chatted with some of the artists present, including 2 Americans, quote unquote, who are represented in the new gallery, Leonard Baskin and Jack Levine. Other American works on the display are by Fernando Botero, William Congdon, Jose de Kreeft, Philip Evergood, Abraham Ratner, Siegfried Gerhard Reinhardt, Ben Shahn, John Sloan, Saul Schwarz, Franklin Watkins, and Max Weber. So I want to look at some of these artists and why they might be included in an exhibit, an inaugural exhibit at the Vatican, and just look through some patterns and trends and try to see what we find. So yeah, here's again Pope Paul VI, the Pope of the artists. So one of the artists who was in attendance was this Leonard Baskin. Sorry, again, my internet connection is extremely slow here. Can you see that okay, Doug?
Yes.
Okay. So here we go. This one, if I can find the quote on this. A lot of Hebrew, a lot of macabre imagery of death. This work says the resurrection of the dead. We don't believe it in any case. The owls and the crows will represent us. Written in Hebrew. Many of these ravens and crows. Looks like something from a Scary Stories book or Edgar Allan Poe illustrations. Very grotesque and macabre. So let me look at another. That's Botero I wanted to get to. Levine. Here's the other artist in attendance, or that's Ben Shahn, I'm sorry. Jack Levine. So clearly not Christian themed by any stretch of the imagination. All these artists are linked to, the Jewish museums and B'nai B'rith.
Here's a seems like it's an international movement and seemingly an international agenda.
Exactly. Yeah. And also this sort of grotesque, deformed, exaggerated looking, nightmarish kind of depiction of the human form, which is vaguely related to sort of Jewish and Christian themes, so they can be thinly, disguised as being sacred art, appropriate for a Christian or a Catholic museum. But then also it has this embedded, sort of socialist agenda of, upheaval of patriarchal structures and capitalist regimes and the status quo. It's a protest movement of protest art. So those are the two artists that were meeting with Pope Paul VI at the opening, and then some of the others here. Fernando Botero, I think is Gentile. William Congdon, I think is Jewish. Philip Evergood is actually Philip Bashkin, I think is his real name. So he's Jewish. Abraham Ratner, Jewish. Turns out 8 of the 13 artists in the exhibit are Jewish. So I think we have that makes it a minion. Here's an essay on the Jewish connection to American social realism, featuring an image by Jack Levine, Ben Shahn, Philip Evergood, artist in Pope Paul VI personal art collection. From Tikkun magazine. Fernando Botero is a artist who's somewhat well known, who makes these like inflated bulbous figures that are meant to be almost like kitsch imagery, like but it's he's one of these artists like who are like the pop artists are playing with this edge between kitsch and fine art.
Right. They had this just
There's
popped into my head. This was back in the 90s, maybe after, but no, I remember it in the 90s along Park Avenue. They had a couple miles of his work on every one of the medians.
Yeah, and here's a Mona Lisa. So obviously it's, these are mockeries. They're meant to be sort of some sort of kitsch commentary on the inflated over indulgency of Western civilization in the modern age. So yeah, that's his shtick, is just these bulbous, obese looking figures.
But when we use the word to come, it's about, the creation of a new order through the destruction of an old. So, I mean, it's not a big stretch to say it's, and when you get a green light from the papacy, or I guess you're saying this is part of a private selection, it seems like delighting in the destruction of Western heritage, or Western sometimes is meaningless. I'll call it the Christian civilization.
Yeah,
Partaking in the light of this, it's like a mockery of it.
exactly. And here's if this will ever load. This artist Philip Evergood, makes that very explicit. The mockery, and it's almost like childlike graphic art, comic books, almost like a precursor to R. Crumb. A lot of image of nude children holding like food items or flowers. Here's another one. Maybe foreseeing the clown masses, Philip Evergood.
So when there's descriptions on this, and in terms of why, oh my goodness, if there's descriptions of this, it's just like the significance of this, it's just some art speak.
Yeah, I don't think this specific work was in the collection. I'm just giving you a taste of this artist overall, but he is it's social realism, and so this concern for the poor and for the marginalized, and corruption in society. Like he has kind of a group of work a lot of times of like these sort of seated, like these sort of images of street corners and working class images of sorry, my internet connection is just ridiculously slow. You have to take my word for it here. Images of the oppressed and this kind of thing, but like here's a lady washing the floors, or a serpent coiled around a tree. So something that's vaguely linked to, biblical allegory, but is applied to a kind of, a social economic issue or racial issue in this particular case. There's like black men being lynched with a serpent coiled around a tree, that kind of thing. And these exhibits were openly mocked by people in the art world, like this attempt to sort of make peace with contemporary world through art is openly mocked, and it's like this is some of the most banal. Like this is called a labyrinth of kitsch, So poking fun at Paul VI's poor art taste in art. Here's an artist, Leon Golub, who is a contemporary of these social realists, Jewish American painter. And this is a portrait of Paul VI kissing a foot. I can only imagine the artist is probably suggesting that it's his own foot. Let's see. And here's Abraham Ratner, obviously a Jewish artist. This is, it looks like a picture of a crucified figure. It says, "We the people." Darkness fell over the land. So you're thinking, why is this Jewish artist painting images of crucifixions and of Christian themes? And you're thinking, well, maybe he's a convert. Yes, this is exactly what we were trying to get to. And let's see what he says. As a Jew, Ratner interpreted the Christian passion narratives in general and in personal terms. "It is myself that is on the cross," he explained, "though I am attempting to express a universal theme, man's inhumanity to man." So if you take that in tandem with Mr. Golub's painting here, and the recent quote or interview where the rabbi says, "What's wrong with Christians is that they're worshiping one Jew when they should be worshiping all of us." I think that's the embedded message here. And Paul VI, who signed Nostra Aetate, seems to be playing along. Another artist who wasn't in this exhibit but is in the permanent collection is Francis Bacon, not to be confused with the 18th century philosopher, who was a open homosexual and hater of all things Catholic, but for some reason Paul VI felt it necessary to collect his artwork of these screaming popes, which is a reference to Edvard Munch's famous painting The Scream, and it's supposed to communicate this level of existentialism, existential dread and anxiety after the horrors of World War II. So and then this new reality of existential crisis that we're all plummeted into, and making sense of the atrocities of the early 20th century.
Let me ask a question.
Sure.
Okay, just to put it in context, what decades was he buying this up? Like, are we talking the 50s, 60s, 70s? And secondly, where did he get the money for this?
I think the early social realist stuff that was part of his personal collection. This was bought by the Vatican after the institution was established, so this was probably bought in the 60s, and then it could be justified as an investment because contemporary art collections became very lucrative. So I seriously doubt Paul VI had money as a cardinal to collect something like Francis Bacon, even though at the time this painting was done in 1949, it was very well unknown. He was an unknown artist who became famous in like the late 50s and early 60s. So I think he was at the time in the 40s and during World War II was visiting art galleries and stuff in Europe, and began a modest art collection.
And Bacon was open sodomite, right?
Right, exactly. And that's one of the reasons he had such contempt for the papacy, because of Catholic social teachings. And, so this is an open mockery of papal authority, patriarchy, the church's hierarchical claims, and sort of pointing the finger at the church for being responsible for the horrors of World War II, of not restraining this Armageddon and allowing the world to pass through the fire. I think that's what this was. One of the images from the collection. So these very grotesque, poorly articulated, distorted images of sacred imagery that seem, it flies in the face of the beautiful, the good and the true, and, the tradition of Catholic art from, the Renaissance, and icons and the Baroque, like these very dignified, articulated images. Now it's this sort of catastrophe of the post-war era, and expressionism and modernism. Max Weber, another one of the artists in that collection. A lot of these scenes of seated rabbis. Who knows what they're talking about? So why would the Pope want to collect artwork like this and exhibit it?
Why? Why?
Right. On and on. More images of these rabbis studying the Torah, studying the writings of the Pharisees. So, yeah, to kind of circle back to what we said, through what crevice has the smoke of Satan entered the Vatican? Could it have been through its new contemporary art collection? And what is this auto-demolition that's taking place? If you're trying to prevent this destruction of the church from happening, why would you be investing in its enemies and opening the doors to them to substitute for images of Catholic beauty and truth? So I think that leads me to Paul VI, and this has been covered by Christopher from Defeat Modernism. I think he's done a video on Pope Paul VI papal portrait that was done by the artist. His name was, let's see here, it's Hartung, I think. Hansing, the artist Hansing, who was a student of Ferdinand Lagar, who's a famous Cubo-futurist. And the image of Paul VI here is at the bottom, and you have these two columns rising up to what looks like the dome of St. Peter's, with this sort of lightning bolt zigzagging down the columns. It looks like some sort of Sephiroth in the center here. And it, it appears as maybe a cross of some sort, but then it looks like Paul VI is holding a dagger. So if you read this article, it's pretty interesting. It takes some creative liberties in its interpretation, but an image such as this, that's like officially, accepted by Pope Paul VI as his papal portrait and hung in the Vatican. It calls for some radical interpretation, like how does this pass through? How is this acceptable? How is this congruent with Catholic teaching and tradition? So, it obviously looks like the columns from, the Masonic columns, and, the Sephiroth tree from the Kabbalah with this, pattern of the energy that flows between the different Sephiroth. And the essay here goes on to say that it's a depiction of the 30th degree of Freemasonry, the Knights Kadash, and in which a dagger is used to stab into the papal tiara, which, as we said before, Paul VI hands over. And it says that there's an all-seeing eye at the top. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but let's see here if there's anything else I wanted to get to. It certainly seems very Masonic, given that the changes that Paul VI did to the Mass. If we look back at what Pope Pius the Ninth externalized exposed the Alta Vendita, the document of Alta Vendita. It says that we're not seeking a pope who is one of us. We're seeking one who thinks like us. So what does it mean to think like the Freemasons? So I want to look for a moment at the dagger that's actually used in the Masonic 30th degree initiation rite. So we have the Star of David, or whatever you want to call it. And I want to read for a second from Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, which he talks about the 30th degree. And it says, the columns of Seth, Enoch, Solomon, and Hercules have symbolized in the Magian traditions this universal law of the equilibrium. And the science of the equilibrium or balancing of forces had led the initiates to that of the universal gravitation around the centers of life, heat, and light. Thales and Pythagoras learned in the sanctuaries of Egypt that the earth revolved around the sun, but they did not attempt to make this generally known, because to do it so, it would have been necessary to reveal one of the great secrets of the temple, that double law of attraction and radiation, or of sympathy and antipathy, of fixedness and movement, which is the principle of creation and the perpetual cause of life. This truth was ridiculed by the Christian Lactantius, as it was long after sought to be proven a falsehood by persecution by papal Rome. So this sounds much like Hegel's concept of tarrying with the negative, where you use two oppositional opposed ideas to work against one another in order to create changes in reality. So this is sort of the idea of the motor of reality is controlled through oppositions and managing those oppositions dialectically against each other. So tarrying with the negative. Negation is the constitutive element of the dialectic. The Hegelian spirit does not avoid death or destruction, but tarries with the negative. In his words, healed by the sword that smote it, the magical power which turns it into a living being. The self-consciousness of spirit is both being and non-being simultaneously in a state of becoming. To quote Hegel, pure being and pure nothingness are the same. And so back to Albert Pike. The Orthodox traditions were carried from Chaldea by Abraham. They reigned in Egypt in the time of Joseph, together with a knowledge of the true God. Moses carried orthodoxy out of Egypt, and in the secret traditions of the Kabbalah, we find a theology entire, perfect, unique, like that which in Christianity is most grand and best explained by the fathers and the doctors. The whole with a consistency and a harmoniousness which is not as yet given to the world to comprehend. The Zohar, which is the key of the holy books, opens also all the depths and lights, all the obscurities of the ancient mythologies and of the sciences originally concealed in the sanctuaries. The secret of the occult science is that of nature itself, the secret of the generation of the angels and worlds, that of the omnipotence of God. You shall be like the Elohim, knowing good and evil. Had the serpent of Genesis said, and the tree of knowledge became the tree of death. For 6,000 years, the martyrs of knowledge toil and die at the foot of this tree, that it may again become the tree of life. The absolute sought for unsuccessfully by the insensate and found by the sages is the truth, the reality, and the reason of the universal equilibrium. Equilibrium is the harmony that results from the analogy of contraries. The unity and struggle of opposites, the coincidenti oppositorum, is the motor of historical development and the secret doctrine of nature. So, Doug, do you have any thoughts here for a second while I regroup?
No, but that's one of the many themes going in my book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse. That's a carryover from my book, Seeing Through the Singularity. It's this condensation in our reality between being and non-being. And what Will's describing here on level 30 is it takes the acceptance of reality, this gets deep, of non-being before you can work the dialectic. Again, I don't know where this is at in the collection, but go ahead, Will.
Yes. So, let's see where I'm going here. Yeah, and this brings us in. So, what is the meaning of this dagger that he's holding? What is he stabbing? And that brings up this issue of kenosis, the kenosis of the church, which is an esoteric concept that gets grafted into, well, I shouldn't say grafted in, but sewn into Christianity through the Protestant Reformation, specifically through Luther and through his study of rabbinic texts like the Talmud and the Zohar. And the kenosis is a Christian reading of the Kabbalistic concept of the Zimzum, which comes from Isaac Luria, who was was alive shortly before Luther, and he was likely familiar with, because Luria's writings spread throughout the intellectual circles of Europe. So this idea of Zimzum is the creation of the universe through God's retraction and self-negation and self-annihilation. So in the beginning, God was everything. And so for him to create ex nihilo, to create everything out of nothing, he must retract himself or remove himself reality to clear a space for being to come into existence. So Luria has this very complex creation story about the shattering of the vessels and the sparks and the shards, and the Tikkun Olam comes out of the story of regathering the sparks in order to reconstellate them into the divine face of God. So God is coming to know himself again through the historical development of reality through the immanence, and that's where man comes in, and that's where man deifies himself and becomes a part of God through regathering these sparks. And so the Sephiroth tree, and the two columns within Freemasonry are a play, of course, on Joachim of Boaz, the porch, the columns in the porch of Solomon's temple, but they're esoterically read as the two pillars or the two columns of the Sephiroth tree, in which the emanation of the Ein Sof in the Kabbalistic creation story zigzags between these various emanations, these points within the tree, and then that's how reality comes into being, and how we reconstruct the divine through managing these opposed Sephiroth. So the kenosis is something I want to talk about here, and how it is a sort of underground theme within the post-conciliar church and modernism, quote unquote.
Well, a lot of what you're talking about, all you kind of packaged right there, a lot of it finally enters into I'll say a modernist interpretation of Catholicism, with a special focus on that verse from Philippians.
So this doctrine of the kenosis, and the Brazilian Catholic historian and researcher Attila Cinque Guimarães, who you cite in Pursue the Metaverse, and I have his book here, The Smoke of Satan, which I've been reading through. Is very, very good, very kindred with the themes discussed in Pursue the Metaverse. So I might, if I have time, read from it here in a bit. But he has a great video on the Tradition in Action YouTube page about the kenosis that I thoroughly recommend, and if I remember, we'll put in the show notes here. But here's a good overview from Teilhard.com, a blog devoted to Teilhard de Chardin and his theology, about the doctrine of kenosis and why it's so critical for modern Catholicism. So having you the same attitude that is also in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, coming in human likeness, and found human in appearance. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So that's the scripture from Philippians, I think you were talking about, that gets used as the typology for Luther's concept of the kenosis. So the term used to describe this passage is kenosis, which comes from the Greek word for emptying. It means the self-emptying of one's own will and becoming entirely receptive to God's divine will. This idea explores this radical concept and how leading Catholic scholars of the 20th century, such as Hans Urs von Balthasar and Karl Rahner, have interpreted this attribute of God in light of scientific discoveries of the last 200 years. The reflection is from a 2006 article by Manuel G. Doncel, S.J., a Jesuit and Spanish physicist, titled "The Kenosis of the Creator: His Creative Call and the Created Co-Creators." So again, very similar to this Lurianic cabala of the Tikkun Olam. So let me read this quote. "The Christian idea of kenosis is grounded in a verse of a New Testament hymn, Philippians 2:7, and has been traditionally applied to the incarnated Logos. But under the Jewish influence of the mystical Zum, kenosis is now also applied in Christian theology to the Creator. This leads to a change of emphasis in the concept of God from absolute power to absolute love. According to Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, such a kenosis, characteristic of any true love, should be presupposed in the eternal love relationship of the divine persons. What we consider in creation or incarnation is a manifestation of this internal kenosis in God's external relationship with creatures, which add its vulnerable nature to kenosis. We can imagine the kenosis of the Creator as a self-restriction in his divine being, freely fulfilled in loving respect for the creations of the created, in order to offer them metaphysical play to exist and to act as autonomous created beings. And I think that's the key here, is the autonomy of history, the autonomy of of society and of man and this brotherhood of man in order to reconstruct God's divine face within the immanence, the autonomy of the immanence over and against the transcendence. And I think that's Teilhard's idea of the cosmic Christ, and the omega point is that we have to self-redeem. We have to, self-liberate ourselves from the strictures of creation. And that's this Gnostic impulse that's embedded within modern Christianity and the modernist project within the Catholicism, and why it's necessary for the church to annihilate itself and lower itself off of its throne as the image of the kingdom of heaven on earth, and become lowly and become so to create the space for the rest of society and the rest of the world to take that place and to create this new order and this new society, or a new utopia. Anything you want to jump in there with, Doug?
I mean, just, that's the exoteric explanation. The actual esoteric agenda is just like what's playing out. It's not about poor people. Pope Francis is kissing the ass of the trillionaires and doing their bidding. I'm sorry. And this is where it all really kicks in.
Right.
It's phony baloney.
Right. Yes. Let's see here. Yeah, and it's tricky because, like, von Balthasar says some great stuff, as we've mentioned before on this channel, but also, and he's positioned himself as this preeminent historian of Gnosticism within, the Catholic Church, and he also speaks, is written against Hegel and saying that German idealism and dialectical theology of like Karl Barth, who was a very close friend of his, is not compatible with Catholicism. Yet he finds this way to circumvent, and through the unity and struggle of opposites, this Gnostic principle, incorporate these Gnostic principles back into modernism through this concept of the Church of Love and the Church of St. John. And actually, let's skip ahead of this real quickly.
Yeah, he wrote the foreword for Tomberg's book on the tarot, and it's an apt criticism of both of them. This overemphasis on love.
Right.
Well, it's really a shifting of emphasis,
and he had this mystic sort of visionary that he collaborated with named Adrian von Speer, and they formed this group called the Community of St. John, which is very similar, sounds very similar, especially this Church of Love concept, to the Johannite church, the Johannite tradition of St. John within Gnosticism that reappears within the Knights Templar, of this secret underground church which exists covertly inside the official Church of St. Peter, that hands down the Johannite gnosis of Kabbalah through the tradition of St. John to St. John the Baptist to Mary Magdalene. So that's this sort of nexus between the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Gnostic Templar mythology, and the Kabbalah, which is the ancient teaching of the Jewish rabbinic sages, and how they're sort of the same thing at the same time, but it's just a different way of concealing it within this simultaneous tradition. But Albert Pike has some stuff on the Church of St. John. I might just skim over real fast, and how it's actually the teaching of the Kabbalah. He says, the secret thought of Hugh de Pons is that in founding this order was not exactly to serve the ambition of the patriarchs of Constantinople. There existed at that period in the East a sect of Johannite Christians who claimed to be the only true initiates into the real mysteries of the religion of the Savior. They pretended to know the real history of Jesus the Anointed, and adopting in part the Jewish traditions and the tales of the Talmud, they held that the facts recounted in the Evangels are but allegories, the key of which St. John gives. The Johannite ascribed to St. John the foundation of their secret church. He who, at the period of the foundation of the order of the temple, claimed these imaginary prerogatives was named the Theoclete. And let's try to get to the part where it goes on to talk about Kabbalah. to establish the Ionite or Gnostic and Kabbalistic dogma where the object of me is proposed to the initiated brethren. The papacy and the rival monarchies, they said to them, are sold and bought in these days, become corrupt, and tomorrow perhaps will destroy each other. All that will become the heritage of the temple. The world will soon come to us for its sovereigns and pontiffs. We shall constitute the equilibrium of the universe and be rulers over the masters of the world. The Templars, like all other secret orders and associations, had two doctrines, one concealed and one reserved for the masters, which was Joanism, the other public, which was the Roman Catholic. Thus, they deceived the adversary. So, yeah, that dual play between the esoteric and the exoteric, the Johannite and a Kabbalistic Jewish tradition, and then openly Roman Catholic at the same time, which is exactly what the Frankists did in the 18th century. So, here's an article that from 1 Peter 5, very good article about von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac, their effect on the Catholic Church. I'm not going to read a lot of this, but it's talking about this esoteric tradition within modernism. It mentions von Balthasar's foreword to Meditations on the Tarot and his celebration of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. And the quote I wanted to read, and also it talks about these two magazines that came out in the wake of Vatican II. There was a liberal journal called Concilium that has Yves Congar, Hans Kuhn, Johann Baptist Metz, Karl Rahner writing for them, and then there was this more conservative Communio, which was Joseph Ratzinger, von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, and so you had this kind of left-wing, right-wing dialectic that was playing out to sort of create these artificial dialogues and scandals or artificial contradictions to sort of propel this new church forward, or this new theology forward, I should say.
And that's why I find that the book that you referenced there fascinating, because the self-demolition or the auto-demolition of the church is a microcosm of what's going on right now. And I know it's hard for people to get their heads around that the same Sanhedrin can control both parts of global politics, because it seems so big and they seem so opposite, this force of Zionism and communism that's being played out. But that's what's happening. And I realize explaining that to people or having people kind of accept that's very difficult when we've been trained our whole lives to kind of be able, we need to see a good guy and a bad guy. But
exactly.
But,
yeah.
Exactly. So they're creating a force field. This is how this is how it works. This is what electrifies the journey through the Kabbalah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a way that they can incorporate in, like, Teilhard de Chardin's theology and Joachim de Fiore's theology, and even Martin Luther's theology now with Pope Francis, having a statue or a coin commemorating him. But here's from this article. It says, Joachim de Fiore's dream was, however, anything but materialistic. His vision was that there existed a divinely inspired historical progression, as noted by the German philosopher George Wilhelm Hegel, from the church visible to the church of the spirit, from the historic gospel to the eternal one, not anti, but trans-Catholic. So this idea of we have to move beyond this, church of stone and enter into this church of the spirit.
Yes,
the spirit
it's happening. The claim, this begins rapidly, through the Protestant Reformation, but this idea that the church is entirely visible, the significance of the Catholic Church, and, I'll even include the Eastern Church in that, is that it's visible.
Yeah.
And that it can only be invisible through the visible. And this is exactly the kenosis of the visible church. So when everything becomes invisible, in a sense, it's the end of history in terms of Catholic theology. That's the significance of this. And that's what the ecumenical movement is ultimately about.
And that's literally their goal, of Hegel, of the Kabbalists, of the Zionists, of
Because that's
Joachim of Fiore.
enough. That there's no, it's the end of reality.
Right, to get to the end of history, to that messianic kingdom, which is not here yet. So, and this is sounds like straight out of Vogelin and out of In Pursuit of the Metaverse. According to Joachim, salvation history was divided into three periods: the Old Testament, or age of the Father, with its rigorous Mosaic law; the New Testament, as the age of the Son, embodied in the Roman sacramental church, founded on Peter; and a final age of the Holy Spirit, tempus amplioris gratiae, a time of universal convergence and freedom from the law, symbolically identified with St. John the Evangelist, the apostle of love. So you see how this conflation of the concept of love is freedom from the law and universal convergence, and this erosion of ontological distinctions and categories.
Exactly, and that's where the book finishes. It's one and the same of the continuation of the French Revolution and the Communist Revolution, where all boundaries dissipate, and that's where you get the end of Karl Marx. Is there's going to be no hierarchy, no reality, and so that's where all these parts come together, and that is the vision of the metaverse.
Exactly, the end of history, the end of hierarchy, and the end of the sacraments. The writer here, his name is Reed Armstrong. It's a very good article. I recommend it. And he goes on to say here, in this vein, de Lubach's book speaks enigmatically, but more or less favorably, of an 1884 speech to the Collège de France by the Polish historian of Slavonic literature. And he says he's an occultist, Martinist, and Freemason. He'd been better to say he was a Sabbatean Frankist. Adam Mickiewicz, on his vision of the future church. You're going to like this, Doug. Christmas at St. Peter's in Rome. The Pope says Mass surrounded by tired old men. Suddenly, in their midst, a young man dressed in purple enters. It is the church of the future in the person of St. John. He tells the pilgrims that the times are fulfilled. He calls the head of the apostles by name, Peter, and tells him to leave the tomb. He comes forth. The cupola of the basilica cracks open and splits, and Peter goes back into his tomb, having given his place to John. The faithful pilgrims die under the ruins. Peter has died forever. The Roman Church is finished. Its last faithful are dead. They, a group of attending Polish peasants, according to Mickiewicz, shall open this cupola to the light of heaven so that it looks like that pantheon of which it is a copy, so that it may be the basilica of the universe, the pantheon, the pan-cosmos and pandemic, the temple of all spirits, so that it gives us the key to all of the traditions and all the philosophies. An ecumenism without boundary stones, with a total opening to the future, still within the Church of Christ, moved to enlarge itself without ceasing to be the immortal dream of remaining Catholic. So this Mickiewicz, here's an article I found about his, does Jacob Frank hold the key to Polish culture? It talks about this Judeo-Christian system that was worked out in Poland from the Sabbatean heretic Jacob Frank in the 18th century, and Mickiewicz's ties to that movement. I'm not going to go into it too much, but it's something we've talked about elsewhere. But I think a lot of the emphasis on modernism, on Freemasonry, ecumenism, even Teilhard de Chardin would do much better to look into this history of the Sabbatean Frankist movement. When we talk about why it's not important for the Pope to be a Freemason, just to think like one, it's this Judeo-Christian system that is important for him to think through, and that's exactly what we see. While most of our friends in Catholic commentary are talking about, the Pope kissing the Quran, the World Jewish Congress is opening an office in the Vatican, and it's announced as though it's nothing in the midst of, what's happening in the Middle East right now. But Mickiewicz, there's
well, a quick connection here is, the Sabbatean Frankist revolution is about, I don't want to drop the word immanentizing the eschaton. That's what I'm always going to say, taking the transcendent reality and making it into this perfect anti-reality. Okay, to enter the new age, the age of the Sanhedrin, it could either be done, the Frankists would say, when the world's all good or all bad, it's equal to, corrupt the world. So right now in the Senate, a common refrain you hear is that we can't bless sin. That's precisely at a metaphysical level what's going on. Once Christ's church blesses sin as part of sacramentally, that's the reality. Remember, hierarchical, historical, sacramentally to bless sin. That's the extreme significance of what's going on, and it might take a year or two to get for this to be sort of formally worked out. Just as this tanglement of alliances might take a couple years to work itself out. It's no coincidence that these things are happening simultaneously, I believe.
Yeah, very good. I agree. Yeah, so the gist of this article is just that Mickiewicz's mission as a Frankist was to emphasize this Polish Jewish messianism, this continuity between Christianity and Judaism, and that's a major theme within von Balthasar as well that reappears in Pope Benedict XVI's writings on the Jewish question, is that Christianity and Judaism are dialectically continuous with one another and mutually dependent on one another, and that's why there's no mission to the Jews, and why Christianity needs to adopt this messianic model of Talmudism and Kabbalah is basically.
I'll just say this right here. This is how I just feel strongly about this. I think a lot of people, when the church and the anti-church more apparently breaks off and it's kind of deciding point, I think a lot of people are going to miss the boat on the Zionist piece right there. That's dual covenant theology that came out in radical Protestantism, not even for centuries until the 19th century. This is a radical apostasy, and it entered the church, the Catholic Church, through modernism of the mid 20th century. And so it's got a cleavage in there. It's still, the whole weaponized ambiguity, but that will be the central cleavage point between the church and the anti-church. And I just think, to the extent that I still can continue doing this, and pushing a boulder up the hill, the Zionism is not going to be part of the true remnant church. If I could just say that in clear and simple terms. And people that are just kind of right now, I think, looking the other way and kind of wanting to play it both ways, eventually you'll have to kind of be able to discern that. I believe, and maybe I'm the only person in the world that's just going to say that quite clearly right now at this point. Do you disagree with me, Will?
I think that's exactly it. And if you want to know what Freemasonry it's about, it's that hyphen between Judeo and Christian. That's the center of the bullseye for the great work, the Masonic great work. And if we're talking about, the Muslim Brotherhood and jihad, and those are just means to an end. That's not the center goal. It's to erode the doctrinal covenantal theology of the church and shift it in this direction where it's seeking resolution in history in this age to come, in this new Messiah, and this new vision of what messianism can be. But yeah, I think that's very well said. Do you want to have anything else you want to say, or do you want me to go on? I got one more little segment here.
I'm good.
All right, great. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about kenosis and try to make sense of the Pope Paul VI auditorium. So the Pope of the artists, who collected these social realists as kind of his final monument to himself, commissioned the Pope Paul VI audience hall, which we know as the Snake Auditorium, and by commissioning the architect Nervi, what's his first name here? Pier Luigi Nervi, who is known as the great Italian god of concrete in the 20th century. So that's when, I know you wanted me to look a little bit more at architecture this time, and sort of this brutalist concrete architectural language of, the conciliar church, and how there's been a stark shift in architecture away from that which is oriented toward the transcendent to this kind of lowly, immanentized, earthly, concrete boxes. And that's another thing that's kind of a side point, like the word concrete shows up over and over and over again. It's almost like a contest within the writings of the modernist theologians, how many times they can use the word concrete in a, concretely concretized within, a treatise or a tractate. It's like that's the favorite word, signaling that, hey, we're Hegelians. Did we mention that we're Hegelians? So to concretize within Hegel's philosophy is to actualize something dialectically through struggle and through contradiction and through taking both sides of a concept, working them against each other until whatever comes out the other side is processed reality and is concretized, and that's what's meant by that. So, here's sort of the architectural plans and picture of the snake auditorium. Still looks like a snake. Still looks like a snake. Fangs. Even the eyeball looks like this kind of reptilian structure. Here it is and being constructed. Scales. Picture that they actually produced on the architect's website here. And it says, succeeding renovations led to the Vatican winning the 2008 Euro Solar Prize. They put solar panels all over the roof now so that it's like net zero or something, for turning its football field sized roof into a giant solar power generator. Also, theories emerged about the design, which pointed to its uncanny resemblance to a snake head. So even here in the the architect's official website, it's saying that it looks like a snake head and not denying that. And this picture is given as proof.
With all the ticky-tacky solar panels slapped on top of it there.
Exactly. And then at the center is, or at the back of the stage, is this famous sculpture that we talked about before by Pericles Fazzini. It's called The Resurrection. And not a good image. Yeah, we've all seen this before, this monolithic bronze sculpture. I found out that the artist actually almost died making it because he carved the original out of polystyrene, like styrofoam, with like a hot knife, and the fumes from the styrofoam caused him to form a blood clot in his lung. But anyway, let me read what the artist says he was trying to represent. Sculptor. Okay. He says, the Vatican commissioned Mr. Fazzini to provide a work for its modern auditorium. The result was The Resurrection, a statue depicting Jesus rising from a nuclear bomb crater. Suddenly, there came to me the idea of Christ preaching peace for 2,000 years, and the place where he prayed for the last time, the olive grove of Gethsemane, said Mr. Fazzini in a book about the work. I had the idea of depicting Christ as if he were rising again from the explosion of this large olive grove, a peaceful sight of his last prayers. Christ rises from this crater torn open by a nuclear bomb, an atrocious explosion, a vortex of violence and energy. So that quote and that image of Christ sort of exploding from the ground out of hell after the resurrection in a nuclear bomb crater, I think is undeniably a reference to Karl Barth's, this excerpt from Karl Barth's letter to the Romans, which he says this about the idea of the church. Let me find it here. Okay. To the proclamations and receiving of this gospel, the whole activity of the Christian community, its teaching, ethics, and worship is strictly related. But the activity of the community is related to the gospel only insofar as it is no more than a crater formed by the explosion of a shell and seeks to be no more than a void in which the gospel reveals itself. So this is part of sort of Barth's neo-Gnostic theology, is that the church cannot be a physical institution. It has to be a void. It has to be something that's been negated. And the gospel comes into the world to destroy all earthly representations. And so he's very much in this sort of apophatic theology tradition. in which there's no way, God is unknown. It's the unknown God, and any attempt to realize him in history is just receiving something as a negativity, as something that shatters our expectations and shatters our ideas of what God can be. So I feel like, von Balthasar is a very close collaborator with Karl Barth, and I think that this Pazzini reference to the nuclear bomb going off is an image to this idea of, and also you have like the Lurianic motif of the husks and the shells, and the spark of the infinite being unleashed from once the shells are shattered, and that kind of imagery. So, and also it's let me find that image again of the where is he here? Okay. Yeah. It also speaks to von Balthasar's "Dare we hope that all men are saved," which uses Origen's theory of the apocastasis or universal salvation, in which after Christ goes into hell, he redeems not only the fathers, but also Cain and all the reprobates and even the demons. And so that, now we have this synod documents that's being leaked out that says that we should pray for the demons. I think that's based on this theology of like universal salvation. And, and that's another Gnostic motif that we don't really have time to go into here, is the rejection of the concept of original sin as being, the mystery of evil in the world, that we have the problem of evil and suffering because of original sin, and Gnosticism has all these convoluted strategies of misplacing original sin onto the demiurge, or to the Kabbalah has its own system of handling the issue of original sin. But anyway, this idea of the church has to be sort of a crater seems like this kenotic image of the after World War II. Now it's the time that the church has to adopt this state of catastrophe and crisis and lower itself so that Christ can burst forth out of the ashes like the phoenix rising.
It's all based on, this is 20th century stuff. This is the infiltration of this Kabbalistic thought front and center, and now it's being externalized and being displayed in front of us, both here in this piece of art and over there in the Synod. But the fundamental problem, and why it's problematic for 2,000 years of theology, is that when Christ was in his passion in the garden, grieving and praying, "Your will, not mine," it was never understood that he severed himself from the transcendent at that moment. And this is where they sneak this in through all these fancy intellectuals. He never left the Father. Arguably on the cross, there was a moment, and people have had debates about that over the centuries, but not at that moment. He did not leave his divine capacity was still within him. And so it seems like a subtle kind of thing, but when you kind of accept that and go down the road, then you've given yourself over to, this is the embrace of this Kabbalah doctrine within, this is modernism at its core. It's at this moment right now that it seeps in. I think this would be the smoke of Satan. Yes, I think that was quoted over 100 years ago for the first time. But I think theologically, it's at this moment right here, an accepting of this idea that a feature of salvation was that this was done by Christ in that capacity. Can you help me out with that a little bit, Will?
Yeah, I really like the way you said that about in the Garden of Gethsemane, and how Christ never severed himself from his divine nature. His human nature and his divine nature in the hypostatic union are always united. And so the crevice that they try to open up for the smoke of Satan to enter, I think, is this kenotic theology that at some point Christ had to reject his divinity in order to come into the world and to suffer along with us. And so that God has to negate himself, so to give autonomy over to the world so that it can enter into its own self-salvation. And I think that's the crux of modernism is tikkun olam. We have to produce our own messianic project to save the world within the immanence, rather than waiting patiently for the eschaton as it
Yes.
has been revealed in Revelation. Yeah, here's another terrible grainy image, but of the atomic bomb by this Philip Evergood artist. I think this is why Pope Paul VI included him. And then it's like a sort of bomb being dropped in the ocean, and all these ships being exploded into the air, and then apes at the bottom. So this menticide and mockery of like the catastrophe after the war. So the bomb, the aftermath of the atomic bomb is meant to be like kind of a microcosm for the zoom and the contraction and the shattering of the vessels, and then now we're left in the aftermath of this new after the crisis, in which we're left to try to pick up the pieces because the old world has passed away and can never come back, and so now we're in it's left to our own devices to
Right. And that's in Freemasonry. That's when the phoenix will rise.
exactly. And so just one last thing to kind of finish up my comments today is this article, The Rebel and the Pope. And it's talking about Hans Küng, who I mentioned earlier as one of the Vatican II Council Fathers, and his work on Karl Barth's letter to the Romans. I think he wrote his doctoral thesis at the University of Tübingen on Karl Barth. And the relationship that Hans Küng had to Paul VI. It says here, from the coin of solid German scholarship, there has come forward a Swiss theologian and priest, Hans Küng, who has presented the Roman Catholic Church with what may be its most profound internal rebellion since Martin Luther. On the far side of the Tiber, dominating Rome's ancient center, is a small 100-acre enclave known as Vatican City. Its vast Renaissance basilica, blah, 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 goes on. Offices of Roman Curia. A bearing that is consistent with the Roman Catholic Church's immobile position on religious issues over the centuries. Nevertheless, today, the Church's leadership is reluctantly acceding to demands for changes in its doctrinal stance and inner discipline that would have been inconceivable 2 decades ago, implementing those changes at his own deliberate pace as the Church's supreme pontiff, Paul VI. And then it goes on to say, Paul, acting through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a vigilant committee for orthodoxy for some 500 years, has ordered Küng to cease and desist from his dissonant teaching. On the face of it, one or the other must yield. Yet those who view the struggle in these uncompromising terms miss the inner significance of what is happening. What we are witnessing once again is that subtle interaction between Pope and dissenter that throughout its history has helped shape the Catholic Church. In the current conflict between reform and immobility within that church, Hans Küng and Pope Paul are unacknowledged co-conspirators intent on achieving Christian authenticity. So this idea of struggle as co-conspirators, I think, is an important motif to understand when we're assessing the contemporary landscape, be it geopolitics or happenings within the church. Just because two factions seem opposed to one another doesn't mean they're not secretly collaborating and using this, what Karl Barth calls a dialectical two-step, in order to foment, a progress toward this new world order, basically. And I want to say the only thing that preserves this and keeps us from that is keeping to the tradition and to what the church has revealed to be the truth and what our eschatological hopes should be, and not lowering them to political imminent reality, and placing our hope in a political messiah. So I had some more quotes and some things, Doug, that we could look at, but I think that's enough for today, unless you have more thoughts that you'd like to share.
No, like if you go into the Protestant world, or they call it trutherism online and so forth, and you see the pictures of the snake and the apocalyptic scene and the red shoes, or the chair of Peter with the upside down cross, or the Pope's crown with a star on it, and it looks evil. It looks evil. And sometimes, the Pope splainers, sometimes correctly and sometimes disingenuously can give you an explanation for all of that. And it's hard to get your head around the idea that where is Christ in all of this? And I came to get this typologically, where the covenant people were under Herod. But Christ established a visible church in a hierarchical fashion. It doesn't always make sense to us. There's a mystery involved, but it is a hierarchical church. And he designed it that way. It's historical, and ultimately it's sacramental. And there's just these kind of common refrains you get that Christ breathed on the apostles. That was something that I really had to get. He created a visible church, and he will live until the end of the era in this church. In particular, he lives through the visible church as well as the invisible, but fundamentally through the visible church. And the magic of kind of getting all this is apostolic succession. He breathed, and so Protestants, they don't talk about this. They've never gotten their heads around. So no matter, if a priest is a sodomite, or even if the Pope is an apostate, Christ lives through the sacraments of the church. And he's still alive in the church, and he commands us to eat his body. It's a commandment. If you love me, you'll follow my commandments. And he commanded people to do that. And so it's hard for people to get your head, like, why would you be submissive to this sort of evil system? This is the human element of the system kind of dominating typologically as it was prophesied to by the doctors of the church. But the Christ is still alive, despite the fact that it's difficult to see. Just like people that didn't want to follow him to the cross, he was disfigured. He appeared to be powerless. He appeared to be kind of almost walking himself through this. He prophesied that he would do this and go through this. Now, modernists, I think, will exploit that typology at the behest of other powers. And some, I think, just fall into an egregore, which is they lose sight. You can't be in an egregore when you embrace full reality, the church historically understood, sacramentally understood, and hierarchically understood. This kind of tiny cleavage, I think, is when we can fall ourselves into ultimately a church that's going to be perverted into an anti-church. And we're living in this time right now where we really have to be discerning. Nobody, in my estimation, has all the answers exactly how this break is going to be going, but we're using kind of this visual journey to help us think through. I think ultimately there are people in the hierarchy right now that are coming out, and it's important to us to kind of take a lead from those people. There are a handful of good, honest priests out there, and we should be looking toward them. There are a handful of honest scholars out there. But this is Christ's church at the end of the day. And sometimes being a Christian and walking, a lot of people want to say, Christ, this is all mediation that we don't need. Christ didn't create a religion. All you need, this is not the understanding of the church. Christ did found a one religion. It's the old covenant that is now the new, one kind of thing, one religion, one hierarchy, one reality. And so sometimes, as it was in the Old Testament for the covenant people in the Old Testament lived through just terrible kings, one after another. And this is what we submit ourselves to. And it's frustrating because our modern minds, all minds, want to make it easy, want to have just confidence. And so we walk through this mystery of Christ's passion, through the mystical visual body of the church. We walk through this passion and faith. And exactly when it seems so confusing and so difficult, just like it is in our own personal lives, when we're overwhelmed in where is Christ in all this? This is when it's time to meditate and we open up. It's precisely these moments of confusion and disinformation that Christ is really speaking to us. Sometimes we get this aha moment and we walk into the mystery of all this frustration and this confusion. And that's part of the walk. And Christ never promised us that this was going to be an easy walk. He never promised us that. In fact, it's the opposite. And so we keep pressing on. And I'm telling myself in this, I used to get frustrated years ago, and I used to say, I don't know why I make videos. Nobody gets this, and so forth. But, you know, in my own private life, I will keep fighting the good fight and persevere. So anyway, Will, if you have any final words, I find a lot of that to be really interesting, and hopefully it kind of just helps us explain why the church is in the condition it's in. It's not supposed to be easy. It wasn't easy for the apostles they wanted a physical kingdom. Their minds just were not prepared for this idea of all the prophecies working toward an invisible heavenly Messiah. And right now, I think people that want a political solution, they want it to be easy, want an earthly answer. But all prophecies that were necessary for salvation were completed on the cross. We are just being tested right now to walk through our faith with all the confusion and all the drama and just stay true to what's been true for 2,000 years. And it does sometimes take identifying some of this modernism to pick out one thing from another. But yeah, thank you, Will, for everything. Do you want to finish with any ideas?
Yeah, that was great. Really appreciate your comments there, and I'm thrilled for the book to be finally out physical form and have it on my shelf and on my coffee table. And yeah, I just wanted to maybe finally say the church, the physical kingdom and the heavenly kingdom exist in an analogous form, on earth as it is in heaven, and this aspect of analogy that is passed through the sacraments. And I think Karl Barth's, the idea of the invisible church versus the physical, apostolic church is an important thing to keep straight in our minds and not lose sight of. And that's kind of the hocus pocus that I think Karl Barth is up to, and von Balthasar as well, is creating, Barth calls the analogia entis, the analogy of being the Antichrist. Which takes some unpacking, but in its place, he proposes a concept called the analogy of time, or the analogy of relations. And so it's and then von Balthasar has this concept of the theodrama, and it's like this idea of history and the story, or the dialectical process of society working out the revelation internally through its own self-critique. And then if you look at like this ARC meeting that's taking place, Jordan Peterson's group over there in London right now, it's all about narratives. It's all about stories. How are we going to write our story? How are we going to construct our narrative that's going to revive Western civilization, rather than how are we going to stay within and abide by the revelation that's been given to us and the institutions that have been given to us. But that's off the table. It's all about, narrative construction. I think Father Mausley's recent video where he mentioned your conversation with over on Vendée Radio was very good. And one of his observations about how, if we're just talking about narratives and stories, we're not talking about the eternal truths. And that, as Catholics and as Christians, that's what we have to focus on, and not get lured into this progressive theological concept.
Yeah, and yeah, I as far as kind of that kind of there are multiple on the conservative side, multiple frankly controlled opposition agents that we need to identify, and frankly, I think stay away from. But I kind of like the work of the amazing Polly over there, identifying the Jordan Petersons and the Pregers and the what's his name, the head of that whole thing.
Oh, I'm blanking right now. Is it yeah, I'm sorry, Doug. I don't know.
We cut this?
Yeah, of course.
Let me just start again then. I'm going to do a hand up.
Sure.
What's his name? Oh, Ben. Okay, let me just
Shapiro,
do this.
Shapiro. Yeah. Duh.
Okay. Yeah. So, Yeah, if I could make a recommendation on that line, the amazing Polly over there and the way she can identify many of these on the right, because I think that's what we're sucked into when we want these answers, because we're trained to kind of look to other people. But the Ben Shapiros, the Jordan Petersons, the Pregers, and that unit, I think what they've come out with right now, when you see these people just saying, I'm okay with genocide, don't overthink, actually have sympathy is to be with the terrorists. If you haven't seen this movie before, but at any rate, I don't want to get too excited about that. But yeah, she does some great work and can kind of help you kind of tease through that. She's a Protestant, and she's quite the researcher. And I'd like to leave it off with, I think we're going to leave a link there to Dr. Kozinski, a great Catholic intellectual. I think that's really on what's going on right now in the world. So some of you might want to consider subscribing to his Substack.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for letting me do this today, Doug, and it's a pleasure as always, and look forward to many more.
Ain't no dang there, Will. I hope you're doing well, and we'll be catching you on the other side, Will. And everybody out there, Dr. Deep State watchers, I hope y'all are doing well, and I'll get back with some new information to you hopefully real soon.
God bless.